Alright, guys, so let's talk about the recent G7 summit because it was just a complete mess. What a complete debacle. And if you think all Western countries are united, it's really time to redo your calculations. We just need to look at the reaction between Macron and Meloni when they were whispering, right? Her face paints a thousand words, but granted, that might just be speculation. But let's look at the concrete results that came as part of the G7 summit, which is absolutely nothing. Even Western leaders and US allies are asking, is Donald Trump with us or does he have his own agenda? The G7 summit really exposes the harsh reality of geopolitics and the economic war. The trade war is not going to stop, and Trump scrambling back to Washington is the cherry on top of the sundae. Now, tell me if you actually caught this part: Trump dropping the US UK trade deal on the floor and Prime Minister Starmer bending down to pick the papers up. And we have economists doing screen grabs just to realize the term sheet is a blank piece of paper. And this kind of sums up the entire summit. It's a nothing burger, but it's nothing to laugh at seriously. It seems we are moving dangerously towards Liberation Day levels, unless Trump does another Taco Tuesday. And let's remember there are scores of US allies whose economies are on the brink. Now, the EU is one, but let's not forget Japan, whose export based industry is in life support. They really need a deal amongst the entire G7 crowd. But as we predicted, Japan is stuck in the summit without a trade deal. So we can expect the auto tariffs and the import tax on steel to really hammer down on their economy. Japan today is stuck with a triple crisis. They are facing a big tariff war of 24 to 25%, especially on auto exports to the US. In the meantime, they are also facing an inflation crisis, the highest of all G7 nations. Plus, they have a debt crisis that's putting a ceiling on how much they can raise rates. The Japanese government is truly caught between a rock and a hard place, and on its own, there's almost zero room left to maneuver. Japan has chosen to risk a debt implosion to combat inflation. We can see their core CPI is around 3.5%, while interest rates are at 0.5%. The Bank of Japan will be continuing on their bond tapering plan. They will be selling more bonds to raise rates to fight inflation, and there's a long way to go for that to be effective. But there's also a dangerous side effect. High rates in Japan could draw in capital flows into yen assets like JGBs, and that might strengthen their currency and in turn hammer their export industry down. As the yen rises, Japan's exports become less competitive, especially when they are fighting with Chinese companies with the RMB weakening down as well. And that's why the G7 summit is just so important for Japan. They needed a deal, and now things are left in limbo. And on July the 8th, the tariff pause would be over. Then all G7 economies, especially the big ones, will know the true meaning of an export collapse. And if you think the US consumer demand is weak today, just wait till the tariffs double in amount. But I want us to listen to Trump's own words because he himself betrayed the agenda. The global ultimatum that we warned about earlier, guess what? It's really the game plan now. Ultimately, you have to understand we are just going to send a letter saying this is what you're going to pay, otherwise, you don't have to do business with us. Now, closing the trade deficit is of paramount importance to Trump. It's on par with trying to wall off the entire Chinese economy. Other places like South Korea, Canada, and even India, they are left hanging without a deal. We know Trump is back in the US for a Security Council meeting, and we have a big feeling that something is going to go down. And by the time this airs, we could be all in a full blown war for all we know. But the here and now is just as important. The world's biggest consumer market is about to get clobbered thanks to the tariffs. This is a big lifeline for many G7 exporters. According to Apollo, if we hit back to the Liberation Day levels, the impact would be disastrous. The effective tariff rates across the US would be 22% on average. Across the board, consumers will face a 22% price increase for most goods, and this will jack inflation higher by 1.5% and crush GDP growth by 1.5% as well. So the G7 has to get their tariff rate down. Protecting the US consumer from Trump is the only way to protect their own revenue. It's a weird line of thought, but this is how desperate things have come. It's not just the US economy that's in crisis mode, The global economy as a whole will suffer, which means large export economies will be in deep trouble, especially those dependent on the US. The IMF is projecting advanced economies to suffer a 0.4% hit to growth. The US will be hit the most, but so will other major economies from Europe all the way to Japan. How about exporting their production to the world? That's going to be a tough sell. G7 exporters are facing a double squeeze. From the right side is the threat from China as well. China is allowing their currency to weaken to keep exports competitive. So trying to sell stuff to Asia and developing markets will also be a very tough sell. Now, the second part of Trump's visit was equally as shocking. Well, maybe not to you and me, but definitely to the rest of G7. Trump just blamed G8 leaders for kicking Russia out of the G8.
The G7 used to be the G8. Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in. And I would say that that was a mistake because I think you wouldn't have a war right now if you had Russia in. And you wouldn't have a war right now if Trump were president 4 years ago. But they threw Russia out, which I claimed was a very big mistake. Even though I wasn't in politics then, I was very loud about it. It was a mistake in that.
Now, to the G7, this was a big hammer blow. Their entire identity is crafted around resisting the Russians. And to hear Trump endorse Russia to the West is just unthinkable. In addition to that, Trump has also signaled he isn't keen on wrapping up the sanctions on Russia, which, to be frank, is actually a good move. But his justification just cuts the G7 to the core. He told Europe to proceed ahead with their sanctions without the US. He is right about how sanctions on Russia will cost the US a lot of money. But to Europe, Trump is trying to do a Burger King. He wants to have it his way without any G7 unity. It's no mean feat to anger your adversaries and isolate your allies all at the same time, but Trump has managed to do it all in just 60 days, right? In just 90 days. And the price of this is sacrificing the US economy. It's truly bizarre when we take a step back. Trump is all over the place. He wants the G7 to isolate China, but at the same time demand them to submit to US tariffs. And that's not how you build a coalition. Now, Sun Tzu's Art of War will be very displeased with Trump's strategy. As a result, US industries are starting to crack. The Fed's June manufacturing index fell to minus 16. It's a big miss from a minus 5.9% forecast and lower than the last reading. Trump's plan to boost industrial growth just isn't working. The idea of tariffing the world to shift demand domestically is just too simplistic. Consumers, they all have a third choice. They simply won't buy anything. Getting cut away from cheaper imports doesn't mean they have to buy more expensive domestic production. People like you and me will just refuse to spend. Meanwhile, there are other interesting events that happened during the G7 summit, and let's talk about it. Now, the G7, more like Europe, is trying very hard to revive their hardline on China. Now, maybe they want to stay relevant, maybe they want to pander to the US, or they're trying to act tough on China. But whatever the case, the G7 has agreed on a strategy to protect its critical mineral supply. There's no action plan yet, it's currently words, but how is Europe going to do it? Nearly 70% of production is controlled by China, while nearly 100% of refining is Chinese. So I'm very curious to see what scheme they can come out with. But let's talk about why this is going to be a tall order and probably going to fail. China's economy, at least in rare earths and supply chains, has a huge leg up versus the West. Now, part of which is the time advantage, right? Beijing spent decades building up their suppliers and all their redundancies. But another element is China's willingness to project financial power to the world. China is the biggest lender or creditor to the developing world, and this is something we need to understand. It's a big reason why the US keeps calling Chinese loans debt traps. It's not because of some noble mission to prevent developing countries from defaulting. The real reason is to stop China from projecting economic influence to key regions in the world. Now, when China gives loans to developing countries, naturally, they will form stronger economic relationships. The G7 could do the same thing, but they aren't. No one is really stopping the US and Europe from lending the world money. Now, take the production of cobalt, an essential resource or critical mineral for the EV industry. They are also used in making chips as well. By 2030, Chinese companies are projected to control 46% of the world's mine cobalt supply. And look where their main supply is coming from. It isn't from mainland China. The majority are from mines within developing countries, and this includes Indonesia and New Guinea. But the bulk of Chinese owned production comes from the Congo, the DRC. So, how did China gain a foothold there? Because they are lending a ton and investing a lot into the region. China will be putting $7 billion to work in the DRC over the next few years, over the next decade. And this is how China is able to control global supply chains, not just in cobalt, but from everything including lithium to germanium. If the G7 really wants to counter China, they have to do a lot more. They have to find a way to invest overseas and play the long game. It's not going to be cheap, it's not going to be easy, and tariffs and export bans are not going to work. And unless they do that, trying to counter Beijing will be a pipe dream. You can't sanction a country that controls 80 to 90% of what you need. It's just not possible. China is a monstrous lender. The amount of money they lend is colossal. In 2021, they loaned out nearly $1 trillion, and that's a trillion in a single year. Even when the amount declined, it's still over $800 billion in 2023. But look at the rest of the lenders, the IMF, the Paris Club, and the World Bank. All those are mainly Western institutions. Chinese loans are probably more than all of these global banks combined. Beijing is putting their trade surplus to work. It's no surprise why they have supply chain domination after 20 years of investing. Beyond just giving loans, China also has another card to play. And because it has a massive export economy, they can help loan money to countries that need liquidity. In other words, if you require Chinese RMB to buy stuff and you lack dollars, China will help you out. Turkey, for example, just renewed their currency swap agreement with the PBOC, so they can swap liras for up to 35 billion RMB to buy Chinese goods, very critical during this tariff war. The flow of dollars might get compromised, so having this swap line is like having an economic lifeline to buy stuff from China. You protect your own currency strength without reliance on dollars. So if the West wants to contain China, they need to tackle everything all at once. But is that even possible today, considering what we have seen? From the G7 summit breakdown, we can observe a rather big takeaway. The Western club is starting to fracture. Members there, they all have different agendas and they can hardly function as a coalition. The US wants to exact its tariff war to the fullest extent but doesn't want to sanction Russia. Europe wants to punish both Russia and China, but frankly, they don't have the ability to do either. And this is the current state of affairs. But let me know what you think. Is this the end of the G7, at least functionally? And why is Europe so obsessed over China suddenly? I don't understand. Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.